Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending this BrainEE meeting. And first of all, I should appreciate the kind acceptance of our invitation by Professor Northoff. You will see today such a prestigious professor is presenting for us today. Thank you for attending the BrainEE's meeting. I think in the previous meeting, I introduced shortly about the aims of our meetings in these BrainEE meetings. So I just briefly, I want to say that there are questions in neuroscience which the neuroscience alone is not able to find an answer for them. Questions about consciousness, free will, identity, coma, near-death experience, Lockedin syndrome, sleep and dreaming, psychokinesis, long-term memory, and etc. It seems an integration of different disciplines, such as philosophy and physics, is required to find an answer for such questions. So in our meetings here, we aim, first of all, to introduce you the key professors and key roles of international key roles to you. So if any of you is interested to know further people in the field, so that's one aim. Second aim is to show the importance of such an integration, how different disciplines are helping neuroscience. And there would be some examples of how, for example, physics or philosophy are helping. And also to find some answers for our unsolved questions in neuroscience. So let me introduce Professor Northoff very briefly, and then we will start. So Professor Northoff is a philosopher, neuroscientist, and psychiatrist all, and he has degrees in all these three disciplines. He is originally from Germany, but now is working in Ottawa, Canada, where his main research is on the relationship between brain and mind. The question, as he has mentioned in his website, the question driving him is why and how can our brain construct subjective phenomena like self, consciousness, and emotions? The interesting point is that he has selected three different approaches to find an answer for his questions. The first approach is a neuroscientific approach, in which he uses such as imaging devices such as fMRI, PET, DTI, EEG, MEG, and TMS. The second approach is a neuropsychiatric approach, in which he is trying to find the causes of disorders. And this knowledge is very vital to produce new treatments. And the third approach, which people like me is less aware of, is about the neurophilosophical approach. And this, the two previous methods were empirical approaches, but this is a more rational one. And this is very interesting for people like me who are coming from an empirical background. As far as I have seen, he has already published 17 books by himself. I don't know how he has time to write so many books, 17 books. And he has also co-authored 49 books and also 2 book translations. And finally, we are very honored to have him today because he is known as the top 1% of scholars writing about the cerebral cortex over the past 10 years. Top 1%. So we are very honored to have you, Professor, today in our meeting, and thank you very much. And we are ready for your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And actually, I do appreciate your culture and your invitation and your cultural background very well, because I have a lot of private connection, also scientific students from your part of the world. So let me share. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, Professor.
Yeah. So I introduce you to what I call temporal-spatial theory of consciousness. And despite all progress in current philosophy of mind, we heard it in the last talk, and also neuroscience, we don't really know the intrinsic connection between brain and consciousness, between neuronal and mental features. So it's like the intrinsic connection between the water molecules and the water itself, the fluid character, and so on and so on. Or here in Canada in winter, it's often frozen. So we don't know that connection between the chemical formula of water, H2O, and the water itself, the quality of water is water. And so we don't know the relationship, the intrinsic, philosophically speaking, the necessary connection between the neuronal activity and the mental activity. And that's really the starting point, the background question of my talk. My talk will develop in three sections. First, I will give a brief background. That's where some conceptual issues come in, not fully elaborated, more sort of the kind of model of brain-mind. But as you know, as engineers and physicists, models, theoretical models, are key because they drive your empirical data analysis and also the setup of the experimental paradigms. Second, I will provide some empirical data to studies of ours recently on the temporal-spatial theory of consciousness. And very short at the end, sort of the third part, what I call coming back to the model of brain and neuroscience I speak of spatial temporal neuroscience, and I will tell you what it means. So let me start with the first one, the background. So, and as often, and I'm speaking here of Western philosophy. It's very important because I do think that there are major differences between Western philosophy, mainly in the Anglo-American world, that dominates all over the world these days, and let's say your philosophical background, and if you go even further eastern, to China. So that's, and I'm sure you have more holistic approaches. So as you know, in the Western tradition, René Descartes said, okay, the mind is special because we cannot observe it in third-person perspective. And then he assumed, okay, there's a special, the mind is special compared to the non-special body. And interestingly, for me, quite amazing, that has been really carried over to current neuroscience. They still assume a specialness of certain, now it's not just the specialness of mind, but it's the neuronal processes in the brain, underlying consciousness that are supposed to be special compared to all the other neuronal mechanisms not being involved in consciousness. So there's a clear divide between special and non-specialness. So I call this the argument of specialness. And of course, that has been somewhat differentiated in philosophy now, philosophy of mind. You have a distinction between reflective and phenomenal consciousness that is sort of reflected in particular the net block distinction psychologically between access and phenomenal consciousness. And also in neuroscience, in the neuroscientific theories of consciousness, it has been discussed, let's say, access consciousness, report paradigms in the global neuronal workspace theory, recurrent processing theory, and the higher order thought theory. And the phenomenal, the IIT, integrated information theory, more assumes the phenomenal consciousness, also here the embodied approaches. And you see these four approaches, as you may know, have been now singled out by the Templeton Foundation to be the major approaches, and that lives icon. Then you have what is non-special. Non-consciousness is obviously special, non-consciousness in philosophy, unconscious processing in psychology, and also the major prevailing theory of brain these days is really the one by Friston, which predictive coding free energy, which I think is mathematically very well developed. But as you will see, from my point of view, it needs some spatial temporal underpinnings. But I will come back to that. But what I want to illustrate here, that you see the specialness of mental features / consciousness is transferred to the neuronal correlates of consciousness as distinguished from those of the neural correlates of unconsciousness. And that really means what we're looking is for differences. Yeah, we're looking for a specific mechanism in the brain which is sufficiently related to consciousness. That's the way the neural correlates of consciousness are defined. And that mechanism must be, and that is sort of implied, principally different from all those mechanisms which do not mediate consciousness. So the focus here is on difference. However, I don't know why that slide is still here. So, however, you might also say, and that is my approach, maybe what is similar between brain and mind. What do they share? Do neuronal and mental features share certain features? And what I mean is neuronal features, not the neuronal features just underlying consciousness, but neuronal features as such, independent from or prior of the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness. So I'm looking for something similarity. And what is this similarity about? So I call this common currency, and we assume that it's really the temporal spatial dynamics. And when I mean temporal spatial dynamics, I very intentionally say here dynamics. So time and space, what I mean is not the time and space as we perceive and cognize them. There are neural correlates for time perception, for time cognition, and the same for space. That's not what I mean. What I mean is the time which is intrinsic to the brain itself, meaning how the brain itself constructs its own inner time, to use a Kantian term, actually, inner time is outer time of the environment. So it's the same when you have a flowing river. Every river has its own intrinsic time and its own intrinsic range of different time scales determined by the flow of water. Same here. I say that the brain, and I will come back to that, has different time scales, has its own flow, continuous change / flow of neuronal activity, and that flow or change of neural activity exhibits certain patterns. And as I assume you're part of UI engineer, so you already know what I'm alluding to. It has a certain pattern. There's a structure in the change. And that's what I'm focusing on. By the way, there's this beautiful quote by Nikola Tesla at the end of the 19th century. Look up his Wikipedia. Very clever guy, a little bit crazy, has his own mind, but very clever. I think this quote is really nice. You need to think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So when I speak of common currency and conceptually, empirically, conceptually, this paper is extremely relevant if you want to understand my current approach. Take a look at it. So what we are looking for similarity, and that's what I mean by common currency. So you have a shared temporality and spatiality construction of inner time in both brain and mental activity. So what we are looking is for shared features of how time is constructed in brain and in our mental features / consciousness. And here, become a little bit more concrete. So basically the shared features are here, temporal spatial dynamics. This is out of this paper. And you see here, you see temporal dynamics in the waves. You have slower waves, faster waves, same in the brain. You all know this, you have oscillation. In EEG is a faster frequency, 1 to 40 hertz. You have slow cortical potentials, 0.1 hertz to 1 hertz. And then you have the very infra-slow stuff from 0.01 hertz to 0.1 hertz, which you usually measure in fMRI. So, and you see that's the kind of time series where you get some information out of this. And also I didn't mention that here, there's a certain topography to these time scales, that the slower time scales of the brain are more in the cortical midline structures, the forward mode network, faster, more in the sensory regions. So what I'm saying, okay, we are searching for temporal spatial dynamics in neuronal and mental features. And I will show you today some data which sort of provides the first half of that equation. I show that temporal spatial dynamical changes are related to consciousness changes. What I sort of leave open, because it's really work in progress, that we also investigate the change in mental features, like your own thought dynamics, your change in self experience, also with the same kind of measures. Meaning we use, and some of you are engineers, I already emphasized it several times, so we use measures like autocorrelation function / window, scale-free activity, power law exponent, median frequency, and Lempel-Ziff complexity, and various others, to investigate not only time series of neuronal activity, but also time series of mental activity pattern. But the latter part is really work in progress. We have some paper in the vision on that, and I will indicate that here. So the search for common currency does not only mean, okay, there's a commonly shared substrate of features between neuronal and mental activity, but it also means methodologically that you can apply similar measures on both neuronal and mental levels. Okay, so now I think that's sort of the conceptual background, and now I really want to go into some of the empirical support, and that's the background of the temporal-spatial theory of consciousness. Just on the side, we develop also temporal-spatial theories of other mental features, like self, like mind-wandering, and also of psychiatric disorders. So you see, we really try to apply this temporal-spatial approach to different kinds of mental features because I need to show the specificity. Yeah, I do not just need to detect some kind of chemical formula related, maybe related to water, but I really need to detect the one that is specific. Yeah, and then specific from other phenomena. Good. So that's basically the conceptual background, the empirical model of the brain. So we conceive the brain in temporal-spatial terms, and I will come back to that at the end of the talk. So here, this is the temporal-spatial theory of consciousness, which we set up in 2017 with a former postdoc of mine. And roughly, I don't want to go into detail. You can look into that paper for the details. But the main idea is that first, we have different aspects of consciousness. Because as you know, every empirical approach is the better the empirical approach slices up the seemingly unified phenomena into different aspects, the better. So here we follow a traditional distinction in the consciousness literature between level state / arousal and content. However, as you also see here, we assume a third dimension, the form of consciousness. And that's really unique to our approach because we say that's the temporal structure, or the spatial topographic whole brain structure. And I will give you examples for that. Then, important, we assume four different mechanisms. Here. You can what we call temporal spatial nestedness, temporal spatial alignment, temporal spatial expansion, temporal spatial globalization. And again, there's not enough time to go into the details of all these mechanisms, but I will show you some empirical data, particularly for these two, temporal spatial alignment and nestedness. And what is important, that here, these two, particularly this one, is related with the spontaneous brain activity which can be measured in the resting state, what is called resting state. This one here, this is temporal spatial expansion, is task-related or stimulus-induced activity. So what the TTC provides, it's really an intrinsic link between resting state and task-evoked activity, and that interaction, let's say, particularly between pre-stimulus and task activity, is key in this temporal spatial mechanism where we assume nonlinear mechanisms at work. You can see this in our papers on non-additive rest-stimulus interaction. So let me go here to the temporal spatial nestedness and temporal spatial alignment. So here, see, I already forgot that I had the slide. See already what we mean. So this is the focus on current theories of consciousness. The global neuronal workspace theory is more interested in late post-stimulus activity. It's probably access consciousness, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, P300B, and so on. The IIT, integrated information theory, claims that it's more interested in the early activity, N100, and more the posterior activity, and associated with the phenomenal component of consciousness. But both share that they have an exclusive focus on the content of consciousness. However, and that's why we share with the predictive coding approach, we have a key focus also on the pre-stimulus activity. So how does the external input interact with the pre-stimulus activity? Because that activity is very important for assigning consciousness or unconsciousness to the external input. There are various lines of research which show the impact of pre-stimulus activity on the contents of consciousness. And then there's the spontaneous activity, which we assume is key for the structure or the form of consciousness. Yeah, and that's, I show you some data on this one, just to give you an idea, and I show you some recent studies of ours, where we show on the disorders of consciousness, temporal-spatial alignment, nestedness, and where we say, look, the topography and the dynamic of the spontaneous activity maybe can serve as common currency, brain consciousness. Yeah, that's the paper where we introduced the form of consciousness, the 2013 paper, which is for me a very important key. And obviously you see, I have a German background, as you can hear from my accent. The concept of the form of consciousness, of course, goes philosophically back to Immanuel Kant. For him, was the form of consciousness key. However, unlike me, who understands the form in temporal spatial terms, he understood the form, particularly in logical terms. This is categories. So that's just a little philosophical sidestep. Yeah, so now I show you the first set of empirical data. So here this was done by a former student of mine in China, Jianfeng Zhang, very clever guy, also originally an engineer, but of course he became also interested in the brain. And here you see how he really gets into the spatial temporal structure, and he did a very nice work. So first, I probably don't need to introduce much here. You know what we look in the brain. We look for time series. Then you have different frequencies. In fMRI, particularly, you measure the infraslow frequency. And then you can also decompose through various kind of analysis. I spare you the methodological detail. You can calculate what you call the power law. It's basically describing the slope of the power spectrum. And as you know, faster frequencies are associated with less power. This is power, this is frequency, both log. And faster frequencies are associated with less power. Slower frequencies have a strong power, and you all know this when you go to the seaside. The big waves, you're really afraid that they smash you back on the beach, where the small waves you basically ignore. And there's another measure which you can do. This is in the frequency domain. The power law exponent is basically the steepness of that curve. The temporal autocorrelation is in the time domain. You take the signal over time, and you basically measure the correlation of the signal with itself from time point to time point. And obviously, you have a higher correlation of more close time points with each other, and so forth across different time lags. That's what you can do. And that gives you the autocorrelation window. So this basically is the temporal structure. This is the frequency structure. And you will see we apply both these kind of measures to disorders of consciousness like anesthesia, sleep, and also vegetative state. So this is the study by this one. And what he did is first he shows that there's a global reduction of scale-free activity in the slow frequency anesthetic state. You see it's basically this is the awake state, subject, inter-subject design, propofol anesthesia, full-blown surgical anesthesia. And you can see it's basically huge difference. The more red, the higher the PLE, the more blue, the lower the PLE. Power law exponent, and you can see that means also if the power law exponent is basically low, you don't have much power in the slow frequencies. And then you see the difference between the awake anesthesia is huge. And now look at this power spectrum. Look here. So these are the awake people, the same people in the awake and the same people in the anesthetic state. So now, of course, the engineer experts among you immediately will say, this is no longer scale-free. And you're right. So meaning the scale-freeness, the power law exponent with this slow, high power, fast frequency, low power distinction is no longer present in the anesthetic state. And these are the same subjects. Yeah. So look at the curve of the power spectrum. This is in the infraslow domain, 0.01 hertz to 0.1 hertz, and it's completely flat. Yeah. So meaning the basic structure of your power spectrum temporal dynamics is lost in these patients. So they lose the structure, and of course, then I would also correspondingly assume that the form of consciousness, that you cannot make any distinction between the processing of slower and faster inputs. So everything is the same, it's just one big black box because you cannot differentiate anymore. So then, very clever, as he is, he also did another measure called neuronal variability, basically the root mean square of the amplitude, or the degree to which the amplitude of the signal fluctuates over time. And you can see again, huge difference, not as impressive as the power law, but still you see major differences here. So and now the question is, which one is really more important? So the SD, standard deviation, the neuronal variability, does not really indicate the structure of the power spectrum or of the signal. It's more sort of the fluctuation, the degree to which fluctuate. So variability decreases in anesthetic state, no surprise. But now you want to know which one is really relevant for consciousness. Is it the power law exponent or the standard deviation? And you see here again the differences are both, and then he correlates the SD, the standard deviation, with the PLE, and you see in the awake they have a strong correlation. In the anesthetic state they no longer correlate. So that suggests, just this finding by itself suggests maybe they have differential roles for consciousness. Now he does the reverse correlation. He correlates the awake state with the anesthetic state. Yeah, so for the PLE, you no longer have a correlation of awake and anesthesia. For SD, you still have a correlation. This is a topographic correlation. Each voxel correlates with the respective other. Yeah, so this suggests that they really have differential roles for consciousness, meaning PLE and SD. So how can he test this now? This is the assumption, spatial dissociation between PLE. And let me take this out, sorry. So then what he did was a very clever thing. He correlated the different subjects with each other. So it's the same subject, but he correlated the subjects PLE voxel-wise in the awake state with the PLE of the same subject, each voxel in the anesthetic state. And what you can see for the PLE, the topography of the voxel was disturbed because the PLE awake and the PLE anesthetic state subject, the same subject, does not correlate anymore. Yeah, and also between subject, it doesn't correlate anymore. This is the intersubject-based correlation. So meaning my spatial topography of the PLE in the awake state is very different from the one in the anesthetic state. So meaning the relative differences in the PLE between the different regions in the awake state are no longer present in the anesthetic state. However, when you look at SD, so this one is the interesting thing. So my SD pattern, topographic pattern, the relative differences in the SD between different voxels is the same in anesthesia here and in the awake state. So this is quite amazing. That basically really means, now I have to put this one in here, that it is not only the temporal structure, but also the spatial structure, the topography that is changed with respect to PLE, but not with respect to neuronal variability. And that means it is really the PLE, the scale-free activity that is key for driving the loss of consciousness. So now let me make it large again. No, doesn't work anymore. Okay, just a second. Okay, doesn't want it. Okay, good. I hope you can see this anyway. So now, so this really says this is initial support that is really the spatial and the temporal structure which is abnormal in these patients. And what is important that both spatial and temporal structure show what can be called as nestedness, meaning like the famous example of the Russian dolls, smaller Russian dolls is nested and contained within the next larger Russian doll, and so forth. So, and there's a self-similarity, but different scales. Yeah, a smaller and a larger one, but the shape is the same. So same here in the brain, that you have a certain spatial topography, which is probably a nestedness, that ultimately the biggest Russian doll in the case of the brain is probably the default mode network, and the smallest one are probably the external primary sensory regions. And in the case of the power spectrum, it's clear the slow frequencies are the biggest Russian doll. The faster frequencies are the smaller Russian dolls. And you can see from these data that it is really this spatial and temporal nestedness which is disrupted in the anesthesia, and we show this also for other data. So meaning this is what we call temporal spatial nestedness as first mechanism of our consciousness of the TTC. Take home message here: loss of temporal spatial structure or nestedness, spatial topography, and temporal dynamics matters for consciousness. And that means, when I mean by structure, I particularly mean temporal spatial nestedness. Okay, so now next one. So that is the first mechanism what I discussed so far, temporal spatial nestedness. The second one, temporal spatial alignment. So when we have consciousness, it's phenomenologically often neglected in the current literature, it is that we experience ourselves and our mental content always within the framework of an environmental context. So we always already, our consciousness is always where we experience our own point of view. What is it like to be a bad Thomas Nagel as part of a wider environmental context? How is that possible? From the neuroscience point of view, it means that our brain somehow needs to be in synchrony and related to the environmental context. And that's what we call temporal spatial alignment. You have perfect spatial temporal alignment when you dance to the rhythm of music and you unconsciously tap your feet in the rhythm of the music. And then you also, and importantly, you feel a groove. You feel the groove of the music, and your consciousness is completely in sync with the music. However, if you do not tap in the synchrony with the music, or as ultimately your consciousness is different, your contents are probably more internal than about the music, or you have no consciousness at all. So the assumption is that this temporal spatial alignment to the external environmental context is key, is a necessary condition of possible consciousness. We call this neural predisposition of consciousness. So, and how does our brain relate to the external environment? One of the working hypotheses in our group is that the brain encodes its environmental context and synchronizes it through its own intrinsic neural timescales. So the primary encoding process, which is a working hypothesis in my group, that is maybe primarily a temporal encoding. What the brain encodes is the temporal stochastics or statistics of the environmental input. And for that, the brain uses its own intrinsic timescales. And you will see this in a later slide. The brain has a variety of different timescales. So here, and if you lose, if my hypothesis is right, that this temporal alignment through the timescales and the temporal encoding is key for consciousness, then you would assume that when you lose consciousness, that your intrinsic neural timescales of the brain are different. So this is this paper which just came out in this year by an Italian postdoc of mine. He's actually a philosopher originally, but he worked himself into all the empirical data, Federico Cirio in Padua. And so, and this is what we probed in this one. So here again, brain dynamics, and here we did again PLE and power law exponent autocorrelation window, and we applied this one now in EEG data. So we're in a faster frequency range 1 to 40. And these are the first data. And first we had a sleep data set. Here you see the typical autocorrelation curve, as I said, 1 to 40 hertz EEG. Here you see the typical power law curve. And here you see the sleep data. And of course, no surprise, everybody knows this. The deeper your sleep, you have different sleep stages, and 1 and 2 and 3, the deeper your sleep stage, the more the impact of the slower frequency and the less the power of the faster frequency. That's very typical, meaning the slope of your power spectrum gets steeper, and that means you calculate a higher PLE. And you see, interestingly, also here, this is a power law exponent, you see, and dream is always interesting. REM is sort of somewhat normalized, but not fully. And here you see the autocorrelation window, and if your slower frequencies become relatively stronger, you have, of course, autocorrelation of your signal over longer time points. That means your autocorrelation window becomes longer. And then he shows the same for anesthesia. Interestingly, again, here this is the ACW autocorrelation window for ketamine and sevoflurane. So you see some difference there. Sevoflurane is much stronger. And here you see the same for the power law exponent. So meaning if your signal becomes more slower frequency and your time windows become much longer, meaning you're losing the shorter, smaller time windows, meaning you lose temporal precision in your input encoding. You cannot differentiate between different stimuli because for that you would need different shorter time windows, which are no longer there. So the assumption, and then interestingly, he also did the same in locked-in syndrome. So these are patients, unfortunately, suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Often it's a muscular disease where you lose all your movements, but you don't lose your consciousness. So you lose all your motor facilities, but apparently your input processing is still intact. And your consciousness is intact. So what we assume, intact input, even if your output is disturbed, / the motor action, as long as your sensory or input processing is still preserved, you still have consciousness. If that is so, the intrinsic neural timescales, the autocorrelation window, should be normal in these patients. And that's exactly what you observe. Here you see the variety of healthy. Here you see the the lateral sclerosis patient, and they're more or less in the range of the healthy subject. And here we also had 2 patients with locked-in syndrome. It's basically the same thing what Stephen Hawking was suffering from. And you see both, as I said, the PLE, power law exponent, ACW autocorrelation window are normal. So that really suggests that it is the input processing which is key for consciousness. If you lose the input processing / the temporal alignment, you cannot have consciousness anymore. Whereas if you lose the output processing, the motor stuff, you still have consciousness. So that's basically, now you will say, how does that prolongation of the intrinsic timescales, these abnormal, suddenly you have a house with an abnormal big window, and your brain is just one big temporal window, but no smaller temporal windows, whereas no temporal precision anymore that you can distinguish between different inputs. If you have just one long window, all inputs are basically put together, and what you just assume, what you probably encode and perceive is no differentiation anymore at all. Yeah, so you cannot, and I would argue, and this is a hypothesis we pursue, that on the experiential or phenomenal level, this basically, you just experience one big soup or one big black box. Yeah, so you lose consciousness. So that tells you the importance of the alignment of the brain. See, the idea is, and here I go a little bit more into detail. So you can see from the names, this is the Iranian student of mine, Meshad Golazorki. So he worked a lot on the time scales in healthy subject, and you see in the brain you have different time scales. You have particularly longer one here in these default mode regions, you have usually a shorter one in the sensory networks. And this ultimately amounts what is called a core periphery organization. But what is important here is that the brain's time scales is a repertoire of time scales, and like here, scale freeness, autocorrelation window, matches with the time scales of the environment. Yeah, if you're too slow, as for instance, when you're in a severely depressed state, you will not be able to synchronize and dance to fast music, because the rhythm, the pace, or the power spectrum of your external music does not match with the power spectrum of your internal brain, or the internal timescales of your brain. So you have a mismatch, and that's what you probably see in many psychiatric disorders. And if you have a complete mismatch, you lose consciousness. Yeah, so this stochastic matching, and we're currently working on that, that we really also try to analyze the input structure, like the music itself in temporal terms, with the same measures, polar exponent, autocorrelation. Yeah, so that just gives you an idea that the consciousness cannot be just restricted to the brain itself, but it has to go beyond, and also the matching between the brain and the environmental structure. So this is clear. So this is already said all that basically matching. And that's the way probably our brain encodes. And that's why it's probably also so adaptive. Come to the conclusion of my talk, very short. I showed you two examples without fully going into detail, particularly on the mental side. And you see, you didn't hear anything about cognitive or affective or sensory-motor or social functions, because that's about brain function. I do think that if you want to understand the mental features, you need to go in a deeper layer. So this is just a surface layer of the brain. This is just basically 5% of the activity we observe. And when you see these cognitive studies, you also see, when you look into the details of the method part, particularly in the supplement, they basically cut out 95% of the signal, because for them it's noise. And then what you see polished in these top journal papers, you see an artificially magnified signal of the brain, which then is related to specific cognitive function. However, that does not account for 95% of the signal, which is not just artificial noise or technical noise, but it's real, there's information in there. And that's the spatial temporal pattern. This is where I say brain dynamics. And that's what we call spatial temporal neuroscience, where I say, look, we conceive the brain in spatial and temporal terms, spatial topography, which I didn't mention at all. You can see papers on global signal topography on our website, and the temporal dynamics I introduced you to some of that. And we also do this in psychiatric patients, because you have changes in the structure or form of consciousness. And then the question is, how does the brain dynamics, how does these spatial topographic changes and temporal dynamic things transform into cognitive affective functions? So for instance, when you always experience very gloomy, you're very sad, you suffer from major depression, the idea maybe is, first, the brain of these people is too slow. Yeah, literally, your median frequency is shifted towards slower ranges, and you see papers on that on our website. And also the topography of the brain is shifted abnormally from the external sensory regions, which are usually faster, to the default mode network, which is extremely slow. So that's a paper by Scalabrini et al. 2020. You see that on our website. So the main idea is really that mental features are spatial temporal dynamic features. I try to indicate that with consciousness, as I said, we do this for self-mind-running psychiatry too. And that in turn provides a temporal structure for your working memory, for your episodic memory, for your emotions, where you conceive, okay, and if you're happy, of course, you're faster frequency. Yeah, so if you have a faster frequency in your brain, of course, you tend to be more happy. Yeah, the extreme of that is mania. Yeah, so we consider even these functions in spatial and temporal terms. That's what is spatial temporal neuroscience. And you see here, so we do not focus so much on specific contents, affective contents, different affective states, primarily as such. But we consider the spatial temporal underpinning, meaning the topographical structure, the whole brain topographic structure, the power spectrum, not only one particular frequency, but the relationship between all frequency, as you see, PLE, power law exponent, autocorrelation windows are typical measures of that. Yeah, so the brain and also then the cognition itself and the emotions are analyzed in terms of spatial temporal, spatial topography and temporal dynamics on both neuronal and mental levels. That's what we're currently doing. And with that, I close. Meaning, main message, which is a work in progress, but I'm much more confident now than some years ago when I came up with the conceptual framing. And now we really lend empirical support to that. And we also combine that with computational modeling, which is extremely helpful because it gives us ways of artificially manipulating certain measures. You can see some of the books I wrote. Just this year came out The Code of Time in Italian, also will come out in English. So main message, topography of the brain, the whole brain topography, the relative weighting between different regions network overall, and the dynamics, the relative weighting difference between different frequencies provide the common currency of brain and consciousness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. It was really an interesting one, and I'm saying that from the deep of my heart that I really enjoyed that. And you did say about Nikola Tesla at the beginning. I think you are also a Nikola Tesla of the time, of course, a clever and wise one. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much, Professor. I know the questions may be from the audience, but I'll start with the first question, and then if anybody has any questions, just please raise your hand. You did say about a variety of timing scales in the brain. Do you think that might be coming from a single pulse generator or something, but then different areas use a portion of that frequency? I mean, there's a single pulse, so but the slower frequencies are a ratio, a portion of that main frequency, or no, there are different generators.
This is a very different question, particularly from an engineer to psychiatrist, because I don't have your background. And it's a very good question. So in neuroscience, as you know, it's usually assumed you have different oscillators. Yeah. Yes. And I don't really know. I'm always, because you see, I'm a holist. Yeah. I link holistic and local activity. For me, is not a contradiction. The local activity is the manifestation of the more local, global. And that goes for both spatial and temporal. And when you have that background assumption, the assumption of specific oscillators is problematic. But I don't have an alternative. What I currently envision is, and that's what I would like to see, and that doesn't answer your question, but let's say each region has the whole spectrum of frequencies. That's clear. The visual cortex is not only fast frequency, it has also the infraslow stuff. The difference between, let's say, visual cortex and default mode network region is the proportion, the relative weighting or difference between faster and slower frequencies. And that may be just because the faster frequencies are more used in visual cortex and not in DMN. Yeah, so the difference. So you see what I would probably assume is, yeah, that's probably my answer. So each region has all the time scales. So meaning each region is basically like a deep temporal layer network, yeah, with all the different time scales. How these time scales are generated is, I must really say, sorry, beyond the scope of my current ideas and also my capacities. I would probably one would probably need to go into physics and engineering for that.
Thank you, Professor. Because in computers, we have something called a central clock. So that clock is always there, and different parts used from that clock. But of course, a portion of it, just as you said, it's coming from an engineering point of view. So
yeah, I more and more consider the brain as basically each region might be a little brain, if you want to say so. Yeah, then I could imagine that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So let's go to the audience. So Parsa, if you want, just ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your great lecture. I want to ask a question. It's just more on the theoretic part of the story. I want to go back to the example you gave about water and how the chemical formula can act as a common currency, causes it to be in the three states we know as liquid, solid, and steam. You introduce spatial temporal correlates as a common currency for a consciousness. Here's my question. You have these spatial temporal correlates, and in some terms, you can call them biochemical, chemical, and electrical activity. But we experience them into consciousness, a mental phenomena. And for water to turn into solid from liquid form, it needs some kind of machine that drives energy from water molecules until they get solid. What is the machine? What is the mechanism in your temporospatial theory that acts as this kind of transforming factor that transforms chemical and electrical activity into consciousness and mental phenomena and mental features?
Very good question, because you pinpoint the finger at the deficits, what I didn't present, and that's of course the difficult thing. Let me answer both empirically and conceptually. First, empirically, what I say, the shared feature between neuronal and mental features is the temporal spatial dynamics. So what we're currently doing, we investigate the dynamics, the change of thought changes. So meaning when subjects indicate my thought content changes, let's say from an internally self-related to an external, more environmental related thought content. And we do this as a time series, and then we analyze how that dynamics, and we can analyze that also with the autocorrelation function. We can analyze that with the scale-free activity, and you'll be surprised if the thought content change, the dynamic time series. You get a quite nice power spectrum, which somewhat reflects some part of the power spectrum of your brain. So this paper is in revision. So this is the kind of things we're doing. We're doing the same with time. So meaning your thought content change has a temporal underpinning, has a certain temporal structure, and I would argue that that temporal structure is shared also with the brain. Yeah, so and that's what we try. So we really say, look, there's a shared feature, and if that shared feature has a certain degree in an optimal functional range, then you experience consciousness. So that's the question, indirect answer to the question, which is here on the lower left in the chat. Yeah, so you need to have a certain optimal functional range of your, let's say, neuronal PLE in order to transform that into corresponding PLE of your time series, and that you experience consciousness. If your PLE is in extreme ranges, like what we have in psychiatry disorder, or when you completely lose consciousness in super extreme ranges, then you lose that consciousness, and then you probably lose that sharing between neuronal and mental features. For instance, when your power spectrum is completely flat, what I showed in the anesthesia people, you don't have this transformation anymore. I hope that answers. On the energetic level, I agree, it's a very good point. That is driven by energy. Glucose metabolism is the main energy source of the brain. And indeed, if you lose your glucose metabolism and also your global brain activity, we and others showed that if that is decreasing, you lose your consciousness. Conceptually, and that is important on the conceptual philosophical side, I would argue that this spatial temporal structure that is shared and allows a necessary but not sufficient condition for the transforming neuronal into mental states is an intrinsic connection or necessary. So if your PLE is in a certain range, in an optimal functional range, let's say in your default mode network, you have a maximal transformation into analogous corresponding thought content change following more or less the same scale-free structure. And that is, for me, conceptually, it's not a necessary a priori, it's not a logical connection, but it's a necessary a posteriori connection. Here I follow Kripke in philosophy as well as Thomas Nagel. I hope that answers some of the question, because this is, of course, obviously a key question you mentioned.
May I just ask something? You said that you consider it as a posteriori condition. I mean, is consciousness not a basic feature of human being, in your opinion?
What is a basic feature, which is always is the predisposition for consciousness, the necessary, the necessary non-sufficient condition of possible consciousness. Yeah, that is probably indeed intrinsic feature, but necessary a posteriori describes more that we cannot logically infer it, but that we must empirically show it.
Empirically show it, yes. Yes.
So, and this distinction between predisposition of consciousness, and I would argue that is indeed an ontological predisposition. I argue for that in the 2018, the Spontaneous Brain book. That is indeed ontologically. Without that, the brain would not be a brain for me. The human brain would not be a brain for me if it doesn't have the predisposition. But that doesn't mean if you lose the actual consciousness that you're no longer a brain, because you can still have the predisposition. It's preserved like in sleep. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you, Professor. So, Mr. or Ms. Hosseini, if you want, you can. It's very noisy. Please check your microphone and we will come back to you again. Dr. Shafaqi, you want to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Many thanks, dear Professor Northoff, for this excellent lecture. I wanted to ask you about the exact relationship or a specific correlation between the concept of a small worthness and consciousness. As far as I know, during such a state, some state like epileptic or non-epileptic seizure conversion disorders, the level of a small worthness that is derived from EEG or fMRI would be decreased or increased. What is the exact relationship between the small worthness and consciousness? Many thanks.
Yeah, definitely the small network is, I'm not an expert on that side, so please forgive me. I'm more on the temporal side. Definitely it's one example. I think the key feature of the small network organization is its nestedness. Yeah, so you have more connected nodes nested within, less connected nodes, more nested within more connected nodes. So I would say, and also as far as I know, again, please forgive me, I'm not an expert in that field, that small network organization is also a spatial scale freeness. And I would argue that that is indeed the key component, that you have the scale-free structure spatially across the different regions, connections. And yes, and I think the data, when you lose consciousness, you lose also the small world organization in the same way you lose the structure of the PLE, you lose the spatial topographic structure. What is for me important that the small network organization, I think a typical measure of that, again, I'm not an expert, could also be the degree centrality. And we pursue more the global signal and global topography, but I think ultimately they two converge. So I would indeed argue if you just lose the small world organization of your network, you lose consciousness. If your small world organization is changed, still preserved, but abnormally changed in certain degrees with certain nodes exhibiting abnormal connectivity relative to others, that you then have an abnormal structuring of your consciousness, and that's what you see in psychiatric disorders.
Thank you very much, dear Professor. I wanted to ask another question. Could we consider and imagine another term in another space maybe, or in another dimension, may be called dynamics of brain dynamics, another term that could explain more higher functions of the brain, a meta-conceptual term.
What again? What was the term?
Dynamics of brain dynamics. For example, we have, you mentioned about the brain functions, that the brain dynamics is higher level relative to the brain functions. And sometimes it could be a more original concept to the brain function. Could we consider in future maybe that we can consider some concepts such as dynamics of brain dynamics, another space or another dimension of the working brain that could explain some higher functions of the brain in another space or dimension?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're trying to do. I mean, in a way, this is already included in my last or second to last slide. Let me upload it again. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
So one way to, for instance, analyze
Yes.
that brain dynamics impacts brain function,
Yes.
you can say, okay, I investigate the power law exponent here, yeah, of my brain. I look at time series of my brain activity, let's say in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I look at the PLE here, yeah, purely neuronally. And then I see whether my brain dynamics / my PLE here in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex impacts my working memory, which you know, which is associated with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. How can you show that? Let's say you decompose your working memory experience / your working memory recall. You have a time series of your working memory accuracy or reaction times to the 2-back or 3-back or 4-back task, and create a time series of your behavioral data, and on that time series you apply again the power law exponent, yeah, on the cognitive behavior. And then indeed, and my hope is that the PLE in the neuronal PLE in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex predicts the behavioral or cognitive PLE of your working memory performance. If that is what you call dynamic of cognition, I would be all with you. Yeah, but that would basically, what for me is important, that brain dynamics is a deeper layer of activity, is your background layer. We usually don't perceive it as such. Yeah, we only perceive the contents here, and then we investigate the neuronal correlates, but that is based on a deeper layer of brain activity, topography, dynamics, which usually operates in the background. It's like the fundament of a house you don't see. You only see the various floors of the house from the outside. Yeah, but you cannot understand the house, the floors of the house, without the fundament. And that's exactly the same, what I assume here. You cannot understand the brain function without the brain dynamics.
Thank you very much, Professor. Many thanks.
Thank you. Professor Shahbazi has typed his question, so I'm reading that for you, Professor. Thanks for your nice time, Professor. Will you please explain how you can exclude this idea that this spatio-temporal correlation may be just an intrinsic property of an awake neural system instead of mechanism of consciousness?
Okay, good idea. Let me put in as a very good question, but let me open another paper of ours, and that's really key. Let me see, just a second. You should be able to see my screen now, right?
Yep.
Let me just look for this paper. Where is it? Just a second. Okay. Ah, here it is. Okay. Okay. Can you see the average is good, extremes are bad?
It's being loaded. It's not loaded. I cannot see it yet. It's getting loaded, I guess.
You cannot see it? Okay, then let me share. Maybe I need to share new.
Exactly.
Okay, and now you should be able to see it. No,
Yes.
This is wrong.
Oh.
Where on earth is the damn thing? No, I lost it completely. Okay, this is very strange. What can you see now on the screen?
This is your slides.
Slides. You don't want to see that. This is very strange. So let me close the slides. And now maybe something else here. Okay, let me start from scratch. This is very strange, and I don't even know where the paper is now. Okay. Okay, so it's there. Okay. And okay, now I need to go back to this. And now I go back to this. And can you see this one now?
Yes.
Average is good, extremes are bad?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, good. So the title is program, and we assume these inverted U-shaped curves. And that's, of course, a very dynamic thing, as you know. Main idea. Look at the glucose. When you have glucose, if you have too much glucose, you have hyperglycemia, is bad, you lose consciousness. If you have not enough glucose, it's bad too. You lose consciousness, hypoglycemia. So, and that's a typical dynamic. So meaning an average range in your level of glucose provides you with optimal functioning. Whereas if you have extremes of glucose levels, it becomes a pathological state in both cases. So it's a disordered function, so you have a certain optimal range of glucose level. So now we assume the same for consciousness. So we assume that if you have a certain range of your power law exponent, yeah, you have optimal functioning and you have the highest degree of consciousness. Yeah, only in the middle range, the average range, you have consciousness. Whereas if it's the same measure, and that's important, PLE, yeah, is too high or too low, you lose consciousness. Yeah, so it's a typical, I don't need to tell you, inverted U-shape is a typical dynamic phenomenon. And that's why we coined the paper, average is good, extremes are bad. So, and I think we even give various examples, and I think, let me show this here. Is this, yeah, here we do this for drug induced for consciousness. So here, indeed, we really show this here for power law exponent. If you have an average power law exponent, you have optimal functioning and sort of somewhat consciousness, you're aware. If you have drug-induced consciousness, your power law indeed decreases because your brain becomes relatively faster and more entropic when you follow the Carter-Harris stuff in drug-induced psychosis. And then basically your consciousness becomes extreme, but then ultimately, if you have too high of the drug-induced psychosis, your consciousness breaks down and your PLE probably completely loses its temporal structure, the kind of things what I show you completely flat. That's probably here. However, I showed you the opposite extreme, that the PLE also becomes flat. There's no temporal structure anymore and complete anesthesia. So at some point, meaning you need an optimal function, and probably sleep is somewhere here, yeah, because you can still recover, you can still go back. In anesthesia, surgical anesthesia, you cannot go back anymore, yeah, because the structure of your PLE is completely lost. And that structure is shifted. So meaning, I would consider these temporal spatial dynamic as intrinsic features of the brain. And the brain, and depending upon the degree of those temporal spatial measures, spatial topography, temporal dynamics, if they are in a sort of average range of their whole possible range, most extreme, maximum and minimum, and the average of that, that's the optimal functional range. And you see that also covers pathological conditions. So I would say temporal spatial features, spatial topography, temporal dynamics are intrinsic features of the brain. If they're lost, you lose. If they're completely lost, your brain is basically not properly a brain anymore. If they are realized or expressed in an average value across all their spectrum, then you have consciousness. If you lose that average, if you go to the extreme, you slip into consciousness, unconsciousness, and ultimately you lose even the predisposition to develop consciousness. I hope that answers some of the questions, and that's why we coined the paper. So this is very important. Average is good, extremes are bad.
Yeah, he asking a second question. What about PLE in animals such as monkeys?
Yeah, good question, good question. So we have one paper where we included rats, anesthesia in rats. That's a paper by Tanabe et al. 2020 about global signal and global signal topography and rats in fMRI, and we could see exactly the same thing, that the global signal was decreased, and that decrease is related to the loss of consciousness. PLE in monkeys, I think there are a couple of studies, where I don't know whether it's PLE, but there are some anesthesia studies in monkeys, and they show similar phenomena. The question is, of course, do these animals have the same time scale and the same range of the power spectrum as we? And I haven't really found convincing papers on that, because it's not impossible that the PLE probably also shift towards the slower frequencies when they lose consciousness is clear. That has been shown in monkeys and also in other animals. But how that depends upon the whole range of the frequency spectrum, that's not fully clear to me, because I didn't come across real data yet showing the range of the frequencies in humans relative to monkeys, for instance. So meaning the degree of different time scales they have.
Thank you very much. We have only 15 minutes left, not to make you much more tired. So I think one or two more questions people can ask. So Ahmed, are you ready to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks, George, for your excellent talk. I have a question regarding your measure of consciousness, I think PLE or something. Can you tell us more about the relationship this measure and this spatial and temporal measure to things others use, for example, energy and phi, you know, about Noni, and energy of Friston, Carl Friston. In one of your previous talk, you said that too much free energy is bad and low free energy is also bad. And here I see the similarity about the optimum of your idea, optimum in the curve. So what relationship between these measures and those measures I mentioned? Can you correct?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me open another paper where I can say something about that. Okay, I need to. Can you see the new paper now? Neuroscience, the Mechanism of Consciousness?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then I don't even need to go. So, yes, you say, how does your stuff basically relate to the others? And I want to show you this table. I know it's complicated and it's hard to see. So first, so the phi, this is about integration, and I would say I have problems with the IIT, to put it very carefully. And it is clear if you have too much, and the empirical proxy for the phi is the Lempel-Ziff complexity. And it's simply not true if you have a high Lempel-Ziff that you have more consciousness. If you have a too high Lempel-Ziff, you lose consciousness. That's simply not true. So meaning the Lempel-Ziff also obeys to this inverted U-shape thing. So then they could argue the Lempel sieve does not really capture the phi. I cannot argue with that anymore. So for me, the phi, I'm extremely skeptical here. And also, it is not just one measure. It is not a one pony trick, just integration. That is simply not true. Yeah, integration is one part of it, and that's information integration, but your brain's dynamic is not always information processing. Yeah, there's this completely amorph dynamics which is not yet related to information. Only in the functionally optimal ranges of your PLE, it may be related to information. Same for integration. So I think information operates way too much still on a superficial level. There's a deeper level, and the notion of integration, yes, it said it's not the same kind of, it's not a content-based, it's more Shannon-based. And your prediction area ultimately is exactly these kind of measures I mentioned, meaning power law exponent, autocorrelation function, uni-transmodal hierarchy of timescales, and things like that. So meaning, if that is really true, and actually we're working on that, we have some stuff in the pipeline on that, that indeed your dynamic measures, autocorrelation with power law exponent, should basically drive your prediction error, your prior, and so on and so forth. And indeed, and the results are really promising. So I would argue that predictive coding and the Temporo-Spatial dynamic approach can be converged. And both would benefit because the predictive coding free energy approach would get sort of a deeper layer, and my Temporo-Spatial approach gets access to the computational mechanism and the excellent mathematical formalization. Last point on that, the free energy, I know it's operationalized as the sum of all prediction errors, which I think drives, is a little bit short because, but maybe I don't understand it proper. Ultimately, I would like to see converging my idea of Temporo-Spatial alignment with the free energy. So this would really be an ecological or neuroecological approach. Yeah, and you see, last thing, in this paper, which is a 2020 review paper, which I wrote with Victor Lamme, where we compared the different theories of consciousness. And you see, so we started with the late stimulus-induced activity, and which theory emphasizes what kind of neuronal activity, early, late stimulus, and then we went further back and back to the spontaneous activity. So, and of course, that ultimately these dynamic and topographic measures which we employ should predict some of the more reliable measures of those theories which operate more on the surface.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. Just one last question. I'm asking because we do not have much time. Sorry, Parsa, because we do not have much time left. So, Professor, sometimes happens in surgeries or in accidents that parts of the brain are resected, but the patient is still conscious. So you think which brain area should be resected that we can no more be conscious? Is that identified yet?
You're asking the right question to the wrong person, because for me, well, first for me, this shows you it's not a single brain region. So this discussion about posterior regions as dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I find ridiculous. I think this is it's a really pre-Copernican, old-fashioned way of approach. Of course, you can make public relation and get a lot of money and be important, but scientifically, for me, I'm sorry, I have no answer to it. That reminds me of localization is stuffed in psychiatry, which is still going on, and I just don't believe it. And my argument is supported by the plasticity, that even sensory function, if you lose your visual cortex, some of those visual functions can be taken over by the auditory cortex. Maybe not as optimal, but it's still, and vice versa, cross-modal plasticity. Yeah, so what your brain cares is a certain topographical structure. And that structure may be more difficult to be realized with a lower number of regions, but if the same temporal structure is more or less preserved, and with more or less the same dynamic range, maybe a little bit more contained, maybe more limited, because you don't have as many regions, so you don't have as much temporal differentiation anymore, and you don't have such a wide range of different degrees of possible connectivity. Yeah, if some of your brain regions go astray and you still have consciousness, but if that is preserved, I would argue you have consciousness. Yeah, so what is important is not the single regions, is not the single frequency. It is that these regions, the role of these regions and these single frequencies is that they make a contribution to the overall topographic structure and the dynamic structure. And it is this structure that is important. That's why I showed you the first data set from Zhang et al. In the anesthesia.
Yeah.
So ultimately, if you replicate that structure in an artificial agent, great, no problem for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. It was really a big pleasure and honor to have you in our meetings, in our BrainEE meetings, and I really appreciate for your acceptance of our invitation. I say again that it was really a big honor for me. Your student Mershad, you said you have one paper together. It was in our lab a few years ago. So I just wanted to say that we would be very happy to invite you to Iran once the situation, of course, is normal, like what I said to Sven. So just ask Mershad if the situation is okay, and we will be very happy to invite you here to Iran to thank and appreciate all your, your contribution in our meeting today.
Okay,
thank you very much again, and I hope this would be a starting for further collaborations. Of course, students would approach you definitely for their future works.
Yeah, I'm very open to that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor, and we made you too much tired today with many questions.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Enjoy your dinner. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.